Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Oh, this was I'll tell the story. Yeah, Civic.
Yes, we haven't yet.
They had these fancy bags that people.
Our thing, but.
M&M's, candy. Yeah.
The thing is,
Very
it's
good.
You can ask them
Yes.
just
Yes. M&M.
or like
Yes.
Metal.
Unless you wanted to do what it is.
And then.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I forgot.
And then you go.
Water.
Do you want my water?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
please.
that's
Science. It's a regular. I think they have one last year. For the receptions. But not hard.
You talk to them about that.
You guys want water?
The post
Yes, our.
Yes, of course.
Totally authorized.
I do, yes.
I just think that
They're saying that
elections, then and you might probably not have it at all.
No, they can come up. I just didn't want to, like, if people aren't allowed to, then I'll leave it up to them, but I think it will come out. As to the degree that, like, some organizations. What's that? These are, they're just in the moment. Yeah, off. Oh, it's me, yes, it's me, yes. I didn't have enough. Yeah, this one. Right. So maybe I can have this third one. This one doesn't seem to work. Yeah.
Very questions on, you know, the subject, you're a historian, you're a, these other people. No, but these other people enjoy towns, they really don't, I mean, I know the autistic guy, I'm questions, but you know, others don't know, they're just there, they shovel through like. Tomorrow, usually people are not poor. Well,
Yeah, what one of these two houses do you want to put this on? I want to mark. Easy. Definitely, yeah. Maybe, yeah, let's. I'll sit here. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to start in a couple minutes. Give another minute or so for people to come in, but we'll get started soon. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for coming. On behalf of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication at George Washington University and the Media and Peace Building Project, also at George Washington University, I wanted to welcome you to this very timely and important event on preventing election violence using media and communication. Now, I'm sure many of you in this room will know this is not only a problem the US is potentially going to face in the near future, but it's an international problem. I think that's what we want to really focus on today. What has happened in other countries where they've had similar issues, and what are the lessons we can draw for the US and other Western countries as they potentially have to deal with this issue as well. It's very obviously unfortunate, but important issue that we have to deal with. My name is Babak Bahadur, and I want to introduce you to our panel of experts. We have 3 experts who all have international experience in this field, coming at it from different experiences and different angles and focusing on some different countries. So our first speaker is Vasu Mohan. He serves as International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IPDGC's Senior Country Director for Nepal and India programs, and Senior Advisor for Conflict and Displacement. Mohan has been with IPDGC since 2001 as IPDGC's technical lead on election, conflict, and security. Mohan provides thought leadership on innovative programs and tools to prevent and mitigate violence throughout the electoral cycle. He has designed, managed, and implemented electoral assistance programs in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka in post-conflict contexts, and supported ICA's election violence mitigation programs in Georgia. I assume Georgia, not the Georgia here, but the other one, yes, Kenya, Libya, Papua New Guinea, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. Mohan led the development of IPSA's flagship election security training program, enabling a peaceful environment to administer credible elections, and is currently leading the update of IPSA's election violence education and resolution program, and was a core developer of IPSA's People Against Violence Everywhere program. So lots of great experience. Our second speaker is Susan Benesch. Susan Benesch founded and directs the Dangerous Speech Project, an independent research team that focuses on rhetoric that can inspire violence and on ways to prevent this without infringing on freedom of expression. To that end, she studies methods to diminish harmful speech online or the harm itself. She also both critiques and advises technology companies to improve content moderation and user behavior. Trained as an international human rights lawyer at Yale, Susan has worked as a refugee lawyer and advocate, publishes widely, and has taught and lectured at universities in many countries. She's an adjunct professor at American University and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. So another excellent set of experiences and knowledge. And our third speaker is Theo Dolan. Theo Dolan currently serves as digital technology and civic activism advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Dolan has 20 years of experience working at the intersection of media, technology, and peace building, including by designing and leading international initiatives to address digital threats such as disinformation and hate speech. Dolan has collaborated with local partners in Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Somalia to produce entertaining multimedia programs to educate young audiences about their roles in building peace and help them feel empowered to take up those roles. While working at international NGOs such as IREX, FHI 360, and US Institute for Peace, he's led programs designed to prevent election violence, counter violent extremism, and support civil society's role in engendering good governance. From 2013 to 18, he lived in Nairobi, Kenya, where he headed regional office of Peace Tech Lab, an offshoot of USIP. Mr. Dolan holds a master's degree at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College. Okay, so we have three excellent speakers who are experts in this field of preventing election violence, especially using media technology communication broadly defined. So I'm going to start off by asking them a couple of questions, and then we will open it up to audience questions. So my first question is, please provide your international experience in one story in which you use media communication or technology in an intervention that aimed to prevent or reduce political violence, especially during election periods. And what lessons can other countries draw from your experiences that could potentially be used in a kind of more universal way, more international way? So I'll pass it on maybe to Susan to start, then to Vasu and to Theo. Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. First of all, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really such a pleasure to have a conversation with such magnificent co-panelists, with Professor Bahadur, and in particular with you. We've all agreed that we're going to try to save lots of time for the Q&A, since that is usually the best part. I will just briefly give you one example, though in many ways it trespasses on what was Theo Dolan's turf. He was living in Nairobi at a time when there were elections in Kenya about which people were terribly, terribly concerned. This was 2012, 2013, the first national presidential and parliamentary election after what is known in Kenya as the PEV, the post-election violence of 2006 and 2007. That time, in 2006, 2007, There were candidates who deliberately, systematically pitted their followers, who were also members of particular ethnic groups or tribes, against the followers of the other major candidate, in a way that Kenyans later described really transformed the way they understood their own identities. People who, had you asked them, who are you, would have said Kenyan before this long campaign of what I now call dangerous speech, having observed it in Kenya, among other places. Dangerous speech is, by the way, rhetoric that has the capacity to lower normal social barriers against violence and inspire intergroup violence by getting one group of people to perceive another as a threat. This campaign was so successful that after it, you could ask people, who are you? And instead of saying, I am Kenyan, they would name their subgroup, their particular ethnic group in Kenya. When those first elections in 2000, end of 2006 fell apart, there was a terrible explosion of violence and more than 1,000 people got killed and 500,000 were displaced. So 5 years later, there was terrible concern to prevent this from happening again. And I took part in one of many fascinating projects, which I'll now quickly describe to you. There is on the Kenyan public television network one program that had been on the air for more than 30 years, and that was watched assiduously by many different Kenyans from different ethnic backgrounds, from even different ages in different parts of the country. It's called Vyoja Mahakamani, which means something like events in the courtroom or a courtroom drama. It was started originally to explain judicial procedure, to explain what happens in a courtroom. And in each episode of this show, someone is tried for something that they may or may not have done wrong. The show is written collectively by all of the actors. There is no screenwriter. So I had the great privilege of taking part in teaching ideas of dangerous speech and and preventing political violence to the team of actors. And then collectively, we wrote 4 episodes designed to do something which I believe is absolutely critical, which is to teach people that violence-inspiring rhetoric or dangerous speech is nothing other than a useful political tool for bad leaders. It is great for gathering up power by frightening people. You might be able to think of somebody who's doing it these days around here. And it's a much easier way of gathering and building up power than actually solving the problems that people have. You say, your problems were caused by these awful other people, and you must take revenge against them. So these 4 episodes aired. In fact, it was almost weird that one of them, by the time it aired, was replicating real life, because the events that it described had actually happened in the meantime. After they aired, we had an independent study done by scholars from the University of Pennsylvania to measure its effectiveness. And in fact, the independent evaluators found that these episodes had been effective in, if you like, inoculating people against such rhetoric. Though I'll just finish by saying that sadly, in the next election after that, another 5 years later, Kenyans were taught a cruel lesson in the same thing when the 2 candidates who had been so ardently opposed to each other in that 2012-2013 election did what in order to get elected? Can you guess? If you don't know. those two who described each other as the most bitter enemies and said that their respective groups were terrible enemies and should be fended off, et cetera, what did they do? They climbed into political bed together. They ran together on the same ticket because that was their best chance of getting elected. And that really drove home the lesson to Kenyans who said, we died for the idea that these two leaders and groups were utterly incompatible. And now for their own political fortunes, for their own ends, they have been perfectly happy to join forces. So that I would not recommend as a good way of preventing political violence because of the pain that it engendered and that led to it. But it nonetheless seems to have been also effective at teaching that terrible lesson.
I think it's interesting that we take politicians sometimes very seriously, but in fact, they're kind of going through the motions of how they consolidate power. They may not even really mean this kind of very strong language. It's what's politically effective, and maybe later on they'll become like join the same group or something if it's politically expedient to do that. That's very interesting.
Yes, this I think if you would take away one thing from what I said, it's that this sort of language that drives people violently apart is just a cynically used, useful, unfortunately very effective political tool. It reminds me of a line in Philip Gorovich's unforgettable book on the Rwandan genocide. We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families, is the title of the book. And in it, Gorovich writes, genocide is a political tool.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. It's always inspiring to hear Susan and Dolan for work for so long. Thank you, Dr. Vasu, for putting together this.
Maybe turn the mic
off. And I've also known Theo for many years, so this is really a good opportunity to be on this panel and reflect on this topic at a very crucial time for us. This sort of distinction we make with work that happens internationally and how sort of the US elections, the US political process unfolds is really, I think, they were always not that, separate, but we, in our own work, and sort of the discourse, it almost felt like there are two separate processes, but it's becoming increasingly clear how much overlap there is and how much there is to learn from other countries' experiences and the ways that they have addressed election violence, divisive rhetoric, and incitement in their communities to apply in our own context more now than ever. The story that I think very interesting, when Babak had originally asked me to speak, I was also going to talk about an experience in Kenya, the same elections and cycles they're talking about. Realizing that they were talking about Kenya, I was going to talk about Indonesia. But I had worked on both of those elections, also to acknowledge a wonderful colleague, a former colleague who's here, who was working on our Africa team, and we can add on some things later. The connection between the Kenya and the Indonesia experience was the organization that I work for, International Foundation for Electoral Systems, was working with election commissions and civil society in both of those countries. And I was the conflict advisor, so I was also engaged in both of those programs. A lot of what I learned from Kenya, from that experience, I was able to share that with colleagues and counterparts in Indonesia. And the successes, the same elements that led to some successful interventions in Kenya were implemented in Indonesia and were again very successful. So this is why I thought this panel is even more interesting. If there are lessons that can go from Kenya to Indonesia, certainly can they go Kenya, Indonesia to the US? Something I'll leave it for you all to consider. The story is this: Indonesia has, it's one of the most diverse countries in terms of language, religion, geography, just the spread of the country, the number of islands in which they have to conduct elections. And this particular story that I want to share relates to 2018, 2019, when there were gubernatorial elections in West Kalimantan province. Kalimantan province is particularly interesting because Indonesia, as most of us know, is a Muslim majority country, probably with the largest Muslim population in the world, but it's also incredibly diverse. And Kalimantan province has what is called Malayu, or the Malay community of the Indonesian, mostly Muslim, and then the Dayak community, which is a term that's used for over 100 indigenous groups who are overwhelmingly Christian or with tribal belief systems. And the gubernatorial candidates were one from each of those, communities. And there was a tremendous amount of fear of violence directed towards these communities because the campaigns, even though the candidates themselves were not at that time using hateful rhetoric, a lot of their supporters were, and this is a common conversation. And leading up to that, there was a blasphemy-related case for a more senior political figure in Indonesia, the capital, who was put in prison for blasphemy. So there was fears of what might happen in Kalimantan. So the intervention that was designed had some key elements, the first of which was that the election authorities committed to working together with civil society to address election violence, the potential of election violence. So the first element, and one of the lessons to look at, is there's a partnership between the officials who run elections and civil society. So this is an important lesson. And in Indonesia, and like many other countries around the world, there is an independent election administration that is responsible for conducting elections. So it's not as decentralized as we find it here. There's an election management body, KPU, it's called. So then there's election management body, and then there's government agencies responsible for addressing, election violations, and then civil society. So this collaboration was very important. What they were able to do at the high level was able to bring a range of candidates to sign, codes of conduct and publicize them, that they will not be engaging in violence or violent rhetoric, divisive rhetoric. In Indonesia, they use a term called SARA. It's a acronym, Suku, Agama, Rasa, and Antargolongan, which is basically religion, ethnicity, identity. So basically, it's certain types of identities that you will not use in divisive rhetoric. So there was a public commitment. Now we all know that codes of conduct and these commitments are only effective if there is an ability to enforce. But the Election Commission is making a commitment to actively enforce them. And this also happened in Kenya, where the Election Commission, as well as there was an entity for interethnic coexistence. So there was those two bodies made that kind of commitment. Similarly in Indonesia. So that was the first tier, this public side of it, and the civil society and government. And then the other is they work very closely with religious leaders. So a civil society organization prepared religious leaders on how to do counter speech, what we now call counter speech. It wasn't called counter speech back then, thanks to all the wonderful work of these colleagues. Now we know this as a very effective way to address hate speech, dangerous speech, and incitement to violence. So they trained religious leaders on how to use their pulpits or their sort of the mosque to be able to de-escalate tension, to be able to talk in a way that would calm tensions without really looking like they take sides, because automatically the communities were divided, the campaign was divided. Even before there was any negative sort of violent speech, the campaigns were automatically divided along ethnicity. So how do you quell tension? How do you, de-escalate tension without looking like you're supporting the other side? So very specific training was provided, and they practiced, and then they taught in their, congregations, encouraging people to engage in that. And then the third intervention that was also interesting was there was a hoax countering center with an organization called Mafindo. So they were able to do a fact-checking, tool, and they did a lot of fact-checking. They established their credibility before the election so that it doesn't become something partisan. but they were able to counter hoaxes, and there were several of that in Indonesia. So one of the key lessons from this story was that there were multiple efforts necessary. There was a whole of society type of approach. Any one intervention alone would not have been, as successful. Overwhelmingly, we look at election violence as sort of top-down responses, as Susan was talking about earlier. But I feel like when you have a combination of these factors, I think we're likely to see less violence. And at the end of that effort, we were able to. There was very little political violence, even though incitement was rampant. There was very little political violence. Results were accepted by both, major candidates, and that became the model then for the general election in Indonesia that came after, which was also pretty divisive between Jokowi and Prabowo, huge, election. So the key elements I think that are that were in that story, religious community leaders, learning to do counter speech, a whole of society, whole of government approach to election violence, were all things that are applicable in other countries as well. They're more interesting stories, but I'll wait for Q&A to share them.
Please, Theo.
Yeah.
Thanks, Babak. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Babak, for the invitation to join this panel, and it's great to be on the same panel as Susan and Vasu, whom I've learned a lot from over the years. Hello, everyone. Happy belated Halloween. I'm Theo Dolan. I'm brand new at USAID, so I'm going to be speaking mainly about my experience working for international organizations like the US Peace Institute, FHI 360, and IREX. As mentioned, I lived in Kenya from 2013 to 2018 while I was working for the US Institute of Peace and its offshoot called Peace Tech Lab, and that intersected with two different election periods. And some of you may know that Kenya is at the forefront of a lot of peace-building technologies, including using technology for election violence prevention by using conflict early warning, early response. So this is the story I wanted to share with you. Even 10 years ago, there were organizations, Kenyan organizations, that were using SMS platforms to be able to do conflict early warning, early response, which was gathering data to be able to act preventatively and react to information that could be used to diffuse tension, counter misinformation, disinformation, and provide factual information about election periods. So in 2017, there were national elections. I was leading the regional office for Peace Tech Lab. We were working closely with a Kenyan organization called the Institute for Social Accountability as part of a project with Mercy Corps. And we took the Institute for Social Accountability's SMS platform. This is a mobile text messaging platform, and we customized it for use in 5 counties in Kenya that were traditional hotspots for election violence. And this was a type of program that had been used to great effect in the previous election period by organizations like Sisi Niamani. And the way it worked is that we went out to hotspot communities in these 5 counties, and we sensitized them on how to use the platform by simply texting in a short code, which is a shortened mobile number, to a central platform with instances of brewing conflict
as well. So the audience like to ask some questions, yeah, please state your name as well and where you're coming from.
Are we passing the mic or just?
Yes.
I-
Thank you so much. Good point. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for your comments and opening statements. My name is Grant Silverman. I'm a research associate here at George Washington University. You addressed the issue of artificial intelligence. I was just in a panel discussion earlier this week about diplomacy and artificial intelligence, so I think that might be a good place to jump off. I wonder if each of you could kind of drill down more on the future of that aspect of technology in conflict prevention, election violence prevention. Of course, you have human users at either end where it's filtered through an artificial intelligence system, whatever that might be, and then it comes out on the other side. So what are some of the ways that you can counter misinformation, disinformation, or kind of just stoking of ethnic tensions, political tensions, through the use of technology and also through kind of more analog systems?
Thank you for bringing it up. As you know, disinformation and hate speech and all kinds of bad content are proliferating because it's so easy to do that with AI. And so it's been mentioned that I've done some work on counter speech. That's humans responding to bad content. And we have really encouraging evidence that that is effective. What we don't know, though, is whether people will be favorably influenced by AI-generated counter speech as they are by human-generated counter speech, or if in fact they can tell the difference. So that's I think some research that is just crying out to be done, and I'm hoping to do it with my colleagues. Another possible response, of course, would be to build lots of bots to respond to the bots, because debate, after all, is an absolutely necessary function in democracy. And what we think is so important about counter speech is that it's very important for the audience, that is to say, what we sometimes call the movable middle, the much larger number of people who watch any online exchange, much larger than the people who are taking part in it. So, for example, if you post something terrible and I respond to it, my goal as a counter speaker is not to transform your behavior or even more difficult, your beliefs. It is generally to instead influence all the other people who are watching on most platforms, and to shift discourse norms in the right direction. So could we do that with a bot army? It's a tremendously interesting question. It's possible that people will in fact be more responsive to counter speech produced by AI and more willing to engage with it than counter speech produced by humans, in part because you can't infuriate a bot unless it has been programmed to be infuriated. So that might in fact be favorable, intriguing. I mean, it's just a guess. As I say, these experiments have not yet been done, but they are urgently needed, and the results will be fascinating. And of course, we should do them before, in my view, before building lots and lots of AI tools to respond to hate speech. However, understandably, lots and lots of teams, at least in the United States and perhaps also abroad, are already building bots to respond to bad content. So we just need to catch up to that effort by the data scientists who love to build stuff.
such a fascinating idea. I want to talk about a slightly different element of this, which is the importance of media literacy for at starting from schools. I think younger and younger children are having access to in their smartphones, in their homes, even through education initiatives that they're engaging in, right? So there's a lot of media literacy at a scale and a level that has never been attempted is needed in this stage. And it's not just, media literacy in the sense just to be able, maybe in this particular case, maybe to be able to detect, AI generated content or to detect misinformation, disinformation. But also, I think parallel to that, there has to be something around ethics, around media ethics, right? And this idea of social cohesion. So I think we need these things have to happen in parallel, that we need to have, civic education, strong civic education in schools, in colleges, not as some add-on, but as core elements of the education system. So that is, and to really understand the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of countries do education around their own national constitutions and their, countries' civic, sort of civics, but it's equally important around the world for us to try at least to begin a common set of values, which we have in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and numerous other, UN conventions and treaties that countries have signed on to. So I think to have that type of education parallel to media literacy, the ability to detect, misinformation, disinformation, and then I would say probably broader training on, conflict resolution and how to even just watch how this content, touches us and urges us to act in particular ways. Like, what is incitement? I think we kind of know when we are inciting somebody else, but do we have the skills to detect that when we are being incited to act in a particular way? I think these are all things that I think will become part of education, in schools. And some countries have begun this type of education already. I was reading a very interesting article about Finland, where some of these elements are being taught in schools. So I think this is going to become as necessary as some of the technological, tools to address AI and AI's influence in elections and political process.
Thanks. Actually, just to build on the points that Susan and Vasu already mentioned, I think we tend to be quite slow in learning from malign actors, and we can use some of the tactics that they employ also to our benefit. For example, instead of spreading disinformation, we can use AI and bots and so forth to be able to promote counter narratives and alternative narratives, and that can be done equally effectively. I would say we just need to be ready and willing to do that. On the media literacy front, I couldn't agree more. In my last position at IREX, I was leading the global programs on Learn to Discern, which is IREX's media literacy curriculum. And just to emphasize the point how important that is to be done at the institutional level in schools, at the community level, and also individually has to be done sort of across the board. And one other point when thinking about AI, and across any technology that's used, the ethics are important. And also the data that's used, for example, to train LLMs is incredibly important to be able to gather data, not just from the global north, which is the vast amount of data that's currently used to train LLMs, but also from the global south. And that's going to take a lot of work to do that. So I guess that's something to focus on going forward, because who is going to do that? Who's going to provide this data? Who's going to gather that in order to be able to train these tools going forward?
Thank you for that. We have an online question. I'll read it out. Debunk bot has been tested with success. Not sure if it's being rolled out in the wild and in non-US English context. Curious if any of the panelists have experience with this tech as we talk about AI-driven solutions. Second question, if we were to prioritize your investment in initiatives to address MDM, what would you fund, prioritize? Understanding context are fluid. So any thoughts on that question? It's very specific, so maybe you don't,
Can you scroll back up, please?
Sure. Do you have it, has anyone heard of debunk bot? I'm not familiar with it. Anyone? No? Okay, so we can skip that part. Maybe just go to the second part here. If you were to prioritize your investment initiatives to address MDM, what would you fund prioritize, understanding the context of fluid? That's something anyone can comment on?
I can start, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know debunk bot, but in general, I would say, debunking, which includes fact checking, is part of the solution when it comes to, she mentions MDM, which is mis, dis, and malinformation. But it's also reactive. Debunking and fact checking is reactive, and that has its drawbacks when trying to change attitudes and behaviors. And also reaching the original audiences. So when you fact check something and debunk something, you don't necessarily know that you're going to be reaching the original audiences, or if you're going to be amplifying the original message that you're trying to fact check. So I'm more of an advocate of working on the prevention space and building digital resilience through approaches like media literacy.
So two specific thoughts. This going back to that Indonesian example that I gave, there was this fantastic local organization called Mafindo. Mafindo was doing exactly this. They were doing, both. So it's a new term that at that time that I learned. It's not debunking; it's pre-bunking. You think of the type, particularly with elections and election violence. Often there's confusion sown about elections being cancelled, or violence happening in some area, or certain, types of misinformation, which is actually in this case sometimes disinformation or malinformation, used to reduce the trust and confidence of people in the electoral process. And this is something that is straight out of the authoritarian playbook, in a context that if I don't get elected, then there is something fraudulent with the process. But to be able to say that, you have to build that narrative before the election. You can't wait till your results start coming. So a lot of, in many countries, we are noticing this upfront candidates who are afraid of losing will start saying that the process is rigged. And that trust is the biggest element that is being attacked around the world right now. Because one thing to, you don't have to go to court to make those statements. You make those statements to make people sow confusion and distrust in the process. So pre-bunking is sort of the concept, I should say, where you foresee or you predict the types of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation that might spread, and you prepare and flood the websites of maybe official cases of election commission or civil society. You put out you flood accurate information. In the past, we would say, institutions need to do voter education. Civil society will do voter education, which is more straightforward information. The types of information that you give, where do you show up to cast the ballot? What do you do if there's a dispute? What type of identity documents are required in countries where that is required. So that's the type of traditional voter education. Increasingly, and in both institutions as well as civil society are having to think about information that is going to be useful as this trust is being, undermined. So they have to be very strategic and thoughtful about putting that information on. Maybe this is where some of the AI bots could be useful to literally flood that information well ahead of elections and across different ethnic groups or communities or languages in different countries. So make sure that information is widely available so that by the time someone is trying to undermine that process, there's plenty of information out there. And we all know that most people verify that information not through official sources, but through a trusted person in their family or their friend. So the idea is to get accurate information in the hands of as many people as possible. And as Susan said, you cannot change the behavior of someone who's intentionally trying to undermine the process, but we certainly can affect and impact those who are not decided or who are not actively trying to undermine the process, but could be easily, susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. So these are different things that are, happening in a lot of countries are beginning to do this more successfully. We definitely need a institutional response as well as a civil society, response, and where they work together. I think it's and particularly if there are minority groups or community groups that are targeted by political actors, then making sure that in those communities this information is available in languages that they trust and through interlocutors that they trust is extremely important. So one-size-fits-all solutions do not work because the way the trust is being undermined is very sophisticated. And our technology is allowing people this targeted information is getting to them, so that the counter effect also has to be equally thoughtful and sensitive in terms of addressing MDM. I didn't know this acronym.
I want to very strongly echo the importance of the interlocutors. And this is another important point about AI. We have lots of evidence that people are more likely to believe what comes from a source they already trust. And so that's probably not a bot. It's one reason why we suspect that that television program in which very, very familiar, well-known actors were putting out messages was effective. There's one actress who played the judge on that Kenyan television program for more than 35 years. And she told this lovely story of going to another city where she was visiting a relative who had some business in court. And so the actress, just as a kind thing to do for her cousin, went along. And the actual judge in the courtroom said, Mheshimiwa, which is Your Honor, please come and sit next to me here on the bench. In other words, the judge himself regarded this actress as a judge because of the role that she had played for so long. We who work in these kind of tech-related or sort of, bureaucracy-related fields often forget the ways in which it is most effective to reach people. We forget about sports figures, although those were also recruited in some cases to correct disinformation and to spread good information. Sports figures are very influential over certain communities. Celebrities of other types from the music industry, for example. And so to answer the second part of the online question, I would invest in finding in each context, that is to say, each country awaiting elections where there's fear of violence, I would invest in finding influential figures over people who are influential over particular populations in which you're trying to prevent violence, and prepare them well in advance, recruit them so that they will be able to spread accurate information and debunk bad information. And then the other thing I would invest a lot of money in is, in fact, taking down and suppressing disinformation, MDM, especially when it is produced by governments. That's a point we shouldn't, I think, miss on this panel. There are governments around the world that spend enormous amounts of time and money and effort to spread disinformation in their own electoral processes and also in the electoral processes of others. So that is a very powerful malevolent force in elections. Tech companies put some effort into that, but there's room for a lot more. And I think that as I think about, how you could be most effective with a limited budget, since that's what one always has, I would suggest those two very different efforts in parallel.
There are other questions from the audience? Yes. Go over here, sir.
Hi, my name is Randy Liaz. I'm a master's student in conflict resolution at the Carter School at George Mason, and I'm also building a network of academics addressing polarization. And I have a two-part question, kind of related. First of all, how do you get those local, the politicians who are running in the elections on board with those pledges, and especially to also follow through with those pledges when the existing incentives are so maligned themselves, right? And I think this is related. Theo, you mentioned that the tools that malign actors use can be leveraged in the same way, and they can be just as effective. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical about that because those tools are being used in a way that leverages the emotion and the identity issues that are at play. And so how do you actually surmount that with those tools and get through in a way that actually lands with people when they're using such effective and cynical tactics?
To your question, your second question there. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, but for example, in the case of malign actors using paid influencers to influence audiences, whether it's in their countries or other countries, why couldn't we also recruit influencers to spread messages about peace or about factual information or election violence prevention? So it can be done. It has to be done, obviously, in a conflict-sensitive way and in an ethical manner. And I would say we have more restrictions than the malign actors do in that regard, but it still can be done. It just has to be done in a very careful way.
To the question about how you get politicians, particularly local politicians, to sign a pledge and stick to it. In some countries, parties have much more control over their candidates than in this country. And so if you can get the parties on board at a national level, then they can require their candidates to stick to rules, just as they require the candidates to stick to a variety of other rules. And then the second option, which can be quite powerful, is you shame people into signing the pledge in the first place, and then you have to have a collective and or independent body that calls them out when they violate the pledge. In many places, the population of the electorate is tired of marinating in endless attacks and awful content, and they're also aware of its capacity to incite violence, which is frightening to people. So the key, I think, is to connect the dots so that politicians begin to fear being identified as the one who is inciting violence. That doesn't always work, of course. Examples spring to mind. But if you can make that link, then it can become a political liability to be the one who breaks the pledge, and that's the goal.
100% echo both of these points, and also to show concrete examples of how that happens also is, more recently, Bangladesh, sort of the student-led movement, even though this was not post-election violence per se, an election that was highly irregular and that was a stolen election, was what led to continuous amounts of discontent, and for almost 15 years, election processes without integrity, keeping somebody in power, led to a student-driven, non-political, non-violent movement for social change. And we vastly underestimate the public's ability to respond to this, right? I think this is really the other piece is it's hard to get people to sign on to them. Even if they do sign on, it's hard to get them to follow it. But having independent institutions that can enforce these pledges or enforce laws that may already be written so that people don't engage in this bad behavior is extremely important. Theo's former workplace, USIP, did a 5-country study on what are effective election violence prevention strategies. And one of the top 2 things that came out of it
is, having election commissions that are competent and able to enforce laws that exist to prevent incitement for violence, and holding people accountable who are able to, who are engaging in election violence. And then the second was to have a security sector that actually also was competent, that was, effective and professional. These were the top two interventions in that study. And that was actually corroborated by an independent study from UNDP that looked at observer reports, over 80 plus observer reports, and went through them to see what type of interventions were in place and then what were effective based on observer reports. And the same conclusion that having effective election management bodies that were then able to collaborate or open to collaborate. So these have to be independent, they have to be competent, they also have to be well resourced. But then so there were some common elements from these studies that showed what would be, effective in. So the pledge alone is not going to be sufficient by any stretch. So we did. Example of the pledge was it's a public declaration, which then can be used as a tool for accountability or even legal, measures could be used, right? So the pledge is the more public-facing visual, and it distinguishes between people, as Susan rightly said, who followed it and who didn't. And this is where civic education and peace messaging to some extent, or sort of peace and justice messaging, I should say, because often in some cases peace can be used as a code word for don't rock the boat or maintaining status quo. So it has to be a message of peace and justice. But if that kind of if the public is empowered over time through civic education, through school-based education, that this is what is expected and this is the norm, then they will automatically hold, or they will be able to hold accountable those who are deviating from those pledges. So the key element is it has to be multi-pronged efforts. No one initiative that we are describing is going to solve this problem, because as Susan said earlier, it is an effective tool, dividing people, sowing fear, inciting violence against a particular group to distract from actual issues that need to be addressed. This is unfortunately an effective tool that uses some of the sort of maybe base elements in all our human nature. It's not, so it exploits that vulnerability that is existing. So to counter that, there has to be very strategic, thoughtful alliances that work over time. And it's not any one electoral cycle. Susan mentioned two in Kenya, they've been further. This Indonesian story also continues over cycles. So these efforts have to be cumulative over time also.
I was just going to say for the next 15 minutes or so, we'll have some more Q&A, and then we're going to have lunch. So just want to give you a heads up that we're about 15 minutes away from lunch. Please, question over here.
Hi, Abby Wilson with FHI 360 Civil Society and Peace Building Department. It's great to see Theo and Vasu, who I've worked with in different organizations before. So my work at FHI 360 usually focuses on very low tech, kind of, I would say low resourced countries that don't always have a big population who speak English. And in fact, I'm now working on a new project to prevent and counter election violence in one of these low resource countries. So what I would love to hear more about are the low tech ways. I know you mentioned influencers and also religious leaders and the importance of the messenger when it comes to messages around preventing election violence and peace. I was just wondering if any of you have other kind of community-based, civil society-based approaches or CBO approaches that you could share that would work well in contexts where it's not necessarily all happening online. And a lot of the sort of incitement to violence is happening in community spaces and in, offline, basically. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. One example. I think community-based theater is a huge resource. And if you look at sort of behavioral change on other issues relating to maybe violence against women or violence against minorities, it's been very effective to engage. So it's very well thought through
theater where it's the participants are involved in it. It's not a performance. A lot of street theater also tends to be, some element of interaction, but it's still performance. But theater where the participants are engaged, and there's also a lot of migrant theater that is coming up around the world. So I think this is something to really explore. It's low resource, low tech, but actually to have a theater group tour or to have a few people go around and run these, you're still going to need resources. But I'm assuming you're talking about low resource as like low tech and yes, because I think it costs. It's not cheap because once you add travel and you want to do it over a particular period of time around the world. But I think theater and art is profoundly effective. And in a way that a lot of our information-based, social media posts and how people engage also, even in technology-based civic and voter education, where there are videos or stories or music, people engage with those posts much more than where it's just content. But I think in theater and then also using, sort of walls in communities to have messages that communities actually are engaged in creating art. This is profoundly effective. And that remains on the walls of those communities. Usually because local people are drawing, it will be locally driven images. There are idioms that they understand, stories that they understand, using that to illustrate and leaving something permanently, in those spaces. Actually, this is the equivalent of a little bit of norm shifting that all these wonderful colleagues work on a lot. I think it has that same effect at the local level. So these are a few examples. More.
Along the same lines, graffiti artists have been recruited. Taggers, I guess one is more correctly calling them, to make murals to prevent political violence. And of course, in low-tech contexts, there are often physical gathering places like a market square where you can reach lots and lots of people, in part because if the image is interesting and compelling enough, people will talk about it and take photos of it and spread them. Because even in relatively low-tech countries, lots of people have phones. And then there's also radio. I noticed that among the maybe online participants, there's Radio La Benevolencia, which is a pioneering organization in making radio programs, for example, in the Great Lakes region in Africa, and also in other places. They have made soap operas, radio soap operas designed to diminish violent divisions between groups of people. For example, in Rwanda, they have very famously in our field been very effective with that. And then I wanted to offer one more idea. We've talked about influencers, about people who are influential over a particular community. The real gold standard is to get them to call out, let's say, misbehavior, which could be hate speech, incitement to violence, MDM, right, mis and disinformation, in their own group, on their own political side. That's what you really want. Because after all, we see it here as in so many other countries, it's easy to denounce it on the other side. It's the same thing, by the way, with the pledges of good behavior. I mentioned political parties denouncing their own because that is much, much more effective than calling it out on the other side, which can sometimes just escalate this stuff. If you can find, though, just a few people who are willing, a few influential people who are willing to take that social and political risk, that is a terrifically important form of behavior to model, and especially in a low-tech environment where influencers' influence is no less great. Finding just a few people to do that specifically might be useful.
Thanks. Hi, Abby. Good to see you. Yes, I was also going to mention radio, which in a lot of places is still the most consumed media, in particular vernacular radio, which is in local languages. So that's important. And I think it comes down to knowing your audience and knowing the types of ways in which your audience is consuming media and information. And I'd suggest also a multimedia approach whereby you could have a peace building radio drama, for example, and layer on top of that social media outreach that might be accessible even on a feature phone where you can use a free version of Facebook for those that don't have access to smartphones. Most people have at least one type of mobile device in many sub-Saharan African countries. So it's a way to reach your audience in more than one way. But yes, just to suggest that vernacular radio is incredibly important.
One other point, something that you asked earlier about tools, and it's I think Audre Lorde who said that the master's tool will not dismantle the master's house. So to recognize that some of the technology tools are by intent, they're set up to exploit some of our base instincts and sow fear in us. So that being said, I think definitely acknowledging that, but also recognizing that overwhelmingly we are using a lot of social media is the way in which people are consuming information in a lot of countries. And some experience, like we live in Nepal and working there, and I see where people are getting information. It's even it's all now on social media. It's unbelievable where I don't know what ways in which people are having the funds to be able to get data, but everything is happening digitally. So I think I definitely like this idea of having multiple ways to reach people. Certainly not miss the more technologically advanced ways of reaching people, but even within that, while content is being created, is there a way to do it more participatory, in a participatory way, with a lot of empathy? Because I feel like ultimately that is the value that will counter hate, is empathy, to be able to constantly put ourselves in other people's shoes who may have nothing in common except being human, but to really look at empathy as that core value. And art is able to do empathy in a way that I think it's able to do empathy in a way that data often is not able to, right? So I feel like but when content is being created, make it more participatory, make it truly democratic. And I think that has an impact. This quote came to my mind: "The master's tool will not dismantle the master's house." And I do think that there's some element of truth in that, because a lot of social. Speaking to experts, and you all know this, but it really preys on our ability. We are more likely, 6 times maybe more likely to forward messages that are false, or even though we know it is false, we still forward them and give them visibility. How do we rethink what do we share, what do we forward? So just a thought.
Before I have time for one more question, we can also have people, if there's people on our Zoom that want to come in with, you can unmute yourself and talk, or if there's an audience question. Oh, there's one here. Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Yeta. I'm from Kosovo, Fulbright from Kosovo. And I have a question based on your experience. Have you encountered a difference between age and gender when it comes to fighting or countering violence from experiences that you had? Gender and age, yeah.
I'll say I haven't studied either of those questions myself. What is striking, though, we all know this, most political violence is committed by men. And I mean, overwhelmingly, most of it. And then much more is committed by young people, of course, younger people than older people. So when I mentioned before in passing, populations among which that you might want to focus on, young men are sort of the obvious population. On the other hand, they will act when they feel that their social context, namely their teachers, their coaches, their friends, their cousins and mothers and sisters and so forth, condone what they might do. Sometimes they're wrong in thinking that. So people who are not so likely to commit political violence should also be taken into account in all of these efforts, because to get political violence, you need a very small proportion of people to commit it and a much larger group of people to condone it. Which leads me to one more thing I was going to suggest earlier that is perhaps useful also in response to your question. We mustn't forget about fear. You know, the prevailing term for bad content on and offline in English and now also in many other languages is hate speech. I'm a bit of a dissenter there, not very interested in the term hate speech, in part because hatred is not the compelling emotion, it's fear. People become much more likely to commit violence when they are afraid of another group of people, when they perceive another group of people as posing a threat to them. And fear, unlike hatred, is also a very powerful biological force in the human body. We know a lot more now about the neurobiology of fear and how it can really prevent people from thinking clearly, from, for example, feeling empathy. So when you are working in low-tech or any other countries to try to prevent violence, the more you can focus on content that is likely to increase the fear in a population, the more successful you will be. We saw a recent example of contextual factors that make people frightened, that may have nothing to do with an election, but that then make them much more susceptible to political content. A very recent example here in the United States was the 2 hurricanes. A large number of people came to believe that Democratic politicians were controlling the weather. And in fact, like some sort of ancient gods, spinning up hurricanes and hurling them at Republicans, at areas where lots of Republicans live. You are laughing. I mean, to me, it's funny also, thank goodness, because of course I know that's not true. But astonishingly, many people became totally convinced of that. And then also another important factor in preventing political violence and protecting democracy and electoral process, by the way, is that people can be made to fear exactly those officials who are there to protect them, like electoral poll workers, including here in the United States, to fear and distrust those individuals who are the sort of face of elections and who literally do elections. And then also they can be made to fear people like the Federal Emergency Management Agency personnel in the United States who were trying to help people who had been severely affected by the hurricane, and instead online MDM, now that we've all learned this term, convinced people that instead the FEMA officials were trying to kill them and steal their land. So these are just reminders of the enormous power of fear that can be ginned up using factors that have nothing to do with elections, like natural disasters, like weather.
Sure.
Just a very small point on this. I think to have women leaders in countries where we're working or communities where we're working actively engaged in violence prevention methods is extremely important. I think when violence becomes the issue, men naturally have become the experts. In a lot of countries, war is the expert, war is the issue, men become the expert. You start talking to men, and we leave out, there's just both. This is not to gender stereotype in any way of, particularly the region that I work. We've had some spectacular examples of women leaders who have led violent, who have actually been very oppressive and violent. But on average, you look at whose voices are not being engaged. If we have kept doing things a certain way and we can't find good solutions, we need to realize who's left out. And overwhelmingly, women leaders in communities, NGO leaders, women peace builders are left out of violence prevention design. So it's very important to make sure that that voice is, that it's as diverse as possible. So when I say men, women, it's also, people from other minorities and different people with disabilities. So have a very diverse group of people thinking about how to find solutions. This is extremely important. The other thing is, in general, young men are a group that are, as Susan pointed out, overwhelmingly incited to violence for various reasons. But also, what is true is that youth-led initiatives of peace building are extremely effective, not only amongst their peers, but among society as large. So this is also something to keep in mind in terms of design of interventions. And in country after country, I just see young leaders who are articulate, who are willing to break away from old prejudices or old patterns of behavior, and using them and investing in them and supporting them in their own journey as peace builders is extremely important. I think this is what will change the trajectory of what is happening around the world. So I feel like the gender, youth. So we do obviously in the international context have, youth, peace and security. There's Security Council resolutions, and there's a lot of international investment. Similarly, women, peace and security, and they're there for a reason. I think these voices are left out of decision making, and the creativity that they bring, and the sort of the diversity of opinions that they bring, and their ability to follow through in their communities, to hold people accountable, to actually do this in-group accountability. They might be a lot more, willing to come out and do the right thing. So I feel like those pieces are very important in the design of peace building initiatives.
And we'll have a very final comment. We're about 5 minutes over, but we can have a short final comment and we'll wrap up with that. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I think just to flag this dangerous phenomenon of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, TFGBV, which is not new, but with social media and AI now, women and marginalized groups are being targeted. And it can have a chilling effect, for example, on women in the public space, and can in some cases even lead to violence. And the important thing about this is that technology-facilitated gender-based violence is most often based on existing gender norms, so it needs to be addressed with that in mind. But it's something that I think requires more research. And in my previous position at IREX, we have an existing program called Transform, which is focused on TFGBV in 3 countries. I'll close there.
Thank you very much, Leo. So with that, Theo, with that, I'd like to thank our panel of experts for taking the time to share with us their insights. Thank you. And also thank all of you for coming and spending time with us. We're all going to continue to discuss these discussions over lunch next out in the hallway. And also thank you to our international people coming in from Zoom. It was very nice to have you join us as well. So thank you to all of you as well. So thanks, everyone. Yes. Yeah.